Senate Bill 3599. So my name is Mindy Ofiana, and I'm the chair for the Legislative Committee. But before we begin, let me recognize some individuals. The presence of Attorney Mukul Bakshi, who is the director for CJFNS, Alliance for Ethical International Recruitment Practices. And I think also Attorney Arnedo Valera, PNAA's legal advisor, law officers of Valera and Associates. So good evening to you both, and thank you for gracing us with your presence. But before we get started, just a little housekeeping. Let us be mindful of background noises. So if you're not speaking, I would appreciate it if you mute yourself. And to prevent feedback noise, please keep your cell phones away from your computer if you are using one. If you have any burning questions so that you will make it more smooth during the presentation, please type them into the chat box, into your control panel. And then Bong, Diane, and I will bring them up during the Q&A portion at the end of the presentation. Okay, so our presenter today is no stranger to PNAA. Bruce Morrison is the chairman of the Morrison Public Affairs Group, which he founded in 2001 to conduct and supervise a broad practice involving strategic advice and representation both in domestic and international clients. His work includes advocacy both in Congress and the executive branch, as well as building alliances within the private sector. He is an expert in immigration policy and practice, and is an immigration consultant and lobbyist, as well as practicing immigration attorney. He represented the 3rd District of Connecticut, New Haven, in the U.S. House of Representatives in 1983 to 1991. He served on the Judiciary Committee and specialized in immigration, and in fact, what led the passage of the Immigration Act of 1990, and also sponsored the enactment of the Immigrant Reform Nurse Act. He served as an advisor throughout the Clinton administration. Mr. Morrison holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry from MIT and a master's degree in organic chemistry from the University of Illinois. He is a graduate of Yale Law School. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Bruce Morrison. Bruce?
Thank you, Mindy. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope that I will get a chance to answer all the questions that anyone on the phone or on the screen has about this legislation or about general issues related to nurse immigration and healthcare immigration. We've spoken before, this group and I, on prior occasions, exploring the impact of various legislative proposals on the Filipino nurse community, as well as on immigration for the future. So you folks are people who have experienced the immigration process, most of you. You have worked as nurses, not only in the United States, but around the world. You know nursing, you know immigration, and you've been great friends of mine and great friends of people who care about the quality of our healthcare system. So with that said, let me give a short summary of what's going on that is represented by the bill S3599. Obviously, I don't have to tell you about the COVID-19 pandemic and about the enormous impact that is having on our country, and especially on our healthcare system. Nurses are on the front line of this battle. Many have gotten sick. A few have unfortunately passed away, and many are really at the end of their rope from the tremendous stress of caring for thousands of patients. So what's first and foremost in the minds of people who are proposing this legislation is that our healthcare system is under tremendous stress, and that the stress is often talked about in dollars, and lots of dollars have been directed to hospitals. And that is important in terms of maintaining the healthcare infrastructure in the country. However, it's not dollars that are at the bedside. It's not dollars who are day in and day out helping people with this disease, especially when it strikes them very hard, as it does for some. So this is about workforce. This is about helping to reinforce the workforce in the United States by making people who are at the doorstep available to help shore up our healthcare workforce resources. That's what this is all about. Now, a thing that is really remarkable about this bill, and I think it's something that everyone who decides to work in support of it needs to have front and center. This bill makes adjustments in the timing of when people get their green card, get an immigration visa to come from abroad, or get a green card on adjustment of status in the United States. But it's really not an immigration bill. It's a healthcare bill. It's called the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act, and that's really what it is. It is an attempt to make our healthcare workforce, in terms of doctors and nurses, more resilient, more flexible, and more able to take care of the patient needs that we have, not only in this immediate crisis, but in the months and years ahead. The co-sponsors, the lead co-sponsors of this bill, tell you what you need to know about how it was put together and what it means. The Republican lead is David Perdue. David Perdue is from Georgia. He would describe himself as a conservative. He has proposed very restrictive legal immigration changes, something called the RAISE Act. But this bill is not about the RAISE Act. What this bill is about is that even though David Perdue is conservative and has his concerns about the numbers in legal immigration, he has signed up to this legislation in order to see to it that the healthcare workforce is adequate at this crisis time. And on the other side of the aisle is Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, who would certainly describe himself as a liberal or progressive, who is the father of the DREAM Act and was one of the Gang of Eight who put forward the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill that passed the Senate in 2013. He's an activist on immigration, and he's very much on the other side of the aisle, and perhaps on the other side of the country from David Perdue in terms of general immigration policy. But the two of them are working together to address this critical need at the center of our healthcare system. So I think that's a great development. And they have carefully constructed the co-sponsorship of this bill so that it is an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. You would search high and low for many pieces of legislation in Washington today that have this kind of breadth of support. People who don't vote with each other or agree with each other day in and day out have decided to get together to make this happen. So that's a very proud moment, and it's one that deserves support, not only because that's a good thing, but because it's a good bill. Now, what is also the case, I can report to you, is as of today, there are 10 Republican co-sponsors and 10 Democratic co-sponsors, 20 of the Senate have signed up in just the last couple of weeks. That's great. That's real important forward progress. And there are other senators who have reported their willingness to sign up, and it's just that the managing to make sure it's always even between the two parties delays the announcement of new co-sponsors. But I can tell you there are more than the 20 who have already agreed to co-sponsor this legislation. And it includes some of the most senior members of both parties in the Senate. So what does this legislation do? It addresses two specific backlogs that are preventing doctors and nurses from being available to our healthcare workforce right now. And those two groups are doctors who have been approved for green cards, but because of backlogs in the green card system, they can't get their green card, and they are tied to their specific employer in the specific location with the specific specialty that they've been approved for on H-1B. And what that means is they can't even get into a telemedicine operation if it's being sponsored by someone other than their employer. And they can't go across town, even to a hospital operated by the same chain of healthcare facilities. And they certainly can't move across state or across the country to go to a hotspot if where they are working doesn't need them as much as that hotspot does. This legislation will give all the doctors in the backlog green cards immediately. They have to apply for them. They have to go through the processing, but they will get the status. They can file immediately. There are expedited procedures so that they will have their work authorization within a matter of a few weeks. And they can then have the flexibility to go where they're most needed. 15,000 visas are allocated for them, and an unlimited number on top of that for their families. That is, families in terms of spouses and minor children. And there probably aren't 15,000 doctors in the backlog. That's probably a bit of an overestimate. But the way the law is written, what determines whether you get the benefit is not the number, but the qualifications. So you have to have had an approved petition during the emergency or before to get this benefit. So, and the nurses are in a slightly different position. Most nurses, not everyone, but most nurses come to the United States on immigrant visas. They come directly to green cards. And that has many advantages in terms of not being tied unfairly to a particular employer or a particular location. And they become people who are on their way to citizenship and full-fledged participation. And from day one, they have the same rights in the workplace as an American, anybody who's here already with full legal status. So, but what that means is they're not here. Earlier this year, the cutoff date for when you could come retrogressed, that is moved backwards from almost current in sometime in 2019 back to January 1, 2017, and created an instant 3-year backlog in nurses who have already been approved with their petition and are essentially waiting an interview at one of the consulates, either Manila or elsewhere around the world, where they may be working or where they may be from. And those, and that backlog is, you know, there are the people, they've already been approved, they're already ready to come, they meet all the qualifications of working in the United States, and they're stuck abroad. What this legislation does is up to 25,000 of individuals like that will get to come in. And those 25,000, that may also be an overestimate. But whatever the right number is, as long as they have filed their petitions within the time frame of up to the end of the emergency, they can come through. So that's the two. It's slightly technically different, but it's addressing the same need. Backlogs that are holding up green card status for needed healthcare professionals, doctors and nurses. And this is the first bill we really had where doctors and nurses are included together. And I think that's a really good thing, because sometimes people try to pit doctors and nurses off against each other for certain kinds of status or benefits. But we all know they're a team, and you can't run any kind of hospital or any healthcare facility without both. So that's what this does, and that's very positive. Now, where do these visas come from? Because as you know, it's controversial. Some people think you can't find any new green cards. But this legislation does something we've done before for nurses, and it's called Recapture. There are at least 200,000 employment-based visas that lapsed in the past, weren't used because of problems at the time, rather than where we are now, where in most years, most of the visas are used. So this taps into those 200,000 visas, and there's more than enough for the 40,000 principals, healthcare workers, and any additional family, which might be another 40,000. So that's, there's plenty of recapture. The fact that this recapture is being supported on both sides of the aisle is very positive for now and for the future. So what happens now? This piece of legislation was designed, first of all, not to be an immigration reform bill. It does not change any of the rules about how you get to come. The nurses have to be just as qualified as always. They have to be just as approved. They have to speak English and read English and understand spoken English. They have to have passed their licensing exam. They have to have been licensed abroad. They have to have a clean disciplinary record. They have to have had an education abroad that's comparable to the United States. So there's no change there. And in the same way, the doctors have all qualified for licensing in the United States. They passed their residency. They've done whatever service they had to do to get a waiver of their J1 home residency requirement. So all the people here are operating on the same rules that existed before. And this makes no change for the future. It's a one-time recapture to respond to the extraordinary demands put on the healthcare workforce by the pandemic. And that's why it has such broad support. And we are hopeful that we can get this inserted in the next phase of COVID-19 legislation. As you know, there have been 4 bills so far. There's a 5th bill. The House has passed a bill, did not include this language, but the House bill is not likely to pass the Senate. The Senate is constructing its own bill, and the senators who are leading this effort on this bill, 3599, hope to get it inserted in that new bill. And that would be the way this would become law and be able to provide this kind of relief. And so the headline is, this is healthcare, not immigration, but it's helping immigrants help our healthcare system. So that's pretty much a summary. I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody has. Can't hear you. You're mute.
I unmuted myself. Thank you, Bruce. So we will go ahead and take some questions for now. So there was a question. Please type your queries on the chat section, and Bong and I will tag team in asking the question to you, Bruce. So let me start. This is from Pete from PNA Northern California. So this is therefore an employer-based visa allocation. How would this impact among Filipino nurses, and what are the chances that this bill be approved?
Well, I don't think this bill is likely to be approved by itself because it's directed very much at the current pandemic. And it's designed to be part of a larger bill. And that's the plan. Of course, if that doesn't work, there can be other decisions. But this is, the people who come are not coming temporarily. The people who get the benefits will be here permanently. And they would all get green cards eventually. The question that the bill asks is, why not now when we need them most?
Mm-hmm.
So that's really what's going to happen. And about 50% and a little more of nurses who immigrate every year are Filipino. They don't all come from the Philippines. Many of them are working elsewhere in the world, in Singapore, in the Gulf states, in Europe. So they may be coming from other places, not necessarily through Manila, but it's about 50% and then 50% from the rest of the world.
I would like to have Attorney Bakshi to talk about a few minutes related to CJFNS endorsement. Attorney Bakshi?
Great, thank you.
Can't hear you.
I'm muted now? Yeah.
There, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mindy, and thank you, Bruce, for that fantastic description of the bill and its importance. I just want to take a note. Many of you are familiar with CJFNS International, which does credential evaluation and licensure on behalf of the U.S. government for visas under the Visa Screen program, and for the state boards through programs like CES to help them with licensure. CJFNS is immigration neutral as a policy matter, but we thought this bill was, focused on a particular problem that we're facing now as a country, when we have tens of thousands of people who have been through the visa screen process, have been evaluated, had their credentials verified as being comparable to a U.S. nurse. And under that kind of narrow situation, we thought, regardless of the larger questions around immigration, this is wrong. We have people who are qualified to come here, who have made decisions about their livelihoods and their families that they want to serve patients in the United States, and the U.S. desperately needs them now more than ever. And so under that exception, we thought this was a really important bill to support. And so I wanted to thank Bruce for the description of the bill and for all his work on behalf of it, and let you know that CJFNS, as part of its mission to serve the global healthcare community, is very happy to support this bill.
Thank you, Dr. Bakshi. Next question.
Okay, here's the next question. Hello, Mr. Morrison. And here's the next question from Lila. Are they going to be assigned as frontliners, and how long is the orientation and training?
Well, it will depend on, these folks will come to whomever has sponsored them. So that they may be sponsored by a particular hospital, or they may be sponsored by a staffing company that has contracts with hospitals. But they will, before they get approved at the consulate, they have to have a job letter. And the job letter has to say where they're going to go. And the job letter under this bill will also have to say that they won't be displacing any American who's already working, which is a good thing, because this is not about displacement. This is adding to the workforce, not subtracting from it. They will, so where they go will depend on who has signed up saying they need them. And that can change right up to the time that they go to their interview. Now, if they've been sponsored by a particular hospital, that hospital won't have them come unless there's a need. In other words, if the hospital has laid off people and doesn't need somebody right now, they're not going to bring the person in. They're going to wait. So the people who are going to come are the people who are needed. Not everybody is needed at the front line. The front line is one thing, but people are moving from other places to the front line. People on the front line are burned out in many circumstances and need to be replaced, or at least backfilled in other positions at that facility. And people in other places in the country, they may not be a hotspot, but they need to be there to make sure the hospital's adequately staffed to deal with the patients, especially now that the hospitals are going to start to reopen and do elective procedures again. there's going to be that much more pressure. My understanding is that a lot of hospitals have been operating with fewer nurses than they need. Now that they, that they aren't doing a bunch of things that they ordinarily do, there's more of a balance. But as soon as they reopen and start to go back to doing elective surgery and people start being comfortable to come back to the emergency room, all of a sudden there's going to be an imbalance again. So the employer, either the hospital or the staffing company, will be the one to make the decision that the person is needed. So in a way, the government is going to provide a certain number of visas. The people who come are going to be the people who are needed, for whom there's a slot. And it's a slot that's not replacing an American. So I think we can be confident that it's doing the right thing for the workforce, and in no way is it doing the wrong thing to people who are here.
Okay, the next question is for you, Bruce. How long, so this is a pandemic prompted bill. How long will this last until the number is exhausted of 25,000, or is it going to be ongoing?
Well, it's not ongoing because there will be a cutoff to eligibility. And the cutoff to eligibility will occur when it's 90 days after the end of the declared emergency. So whenever the president's emergency declaration expires, and action will have to occur. There's no expiration date right now. But when that expiration date is set, then for 90 days after that, petitions continue to be approved. And any petition approved anytime in the past that hasn't been filled by the person coming, up through that 90 days after the end of the emergency, those will be the people who can come. 25,000 is the maximum. There aren't 25,000 in the backlog right now. It's fewer than that. So probably it'll be somewhere between 20 and 25,000. It's not permanent. It can be extended in the future if people support it. But right now, the energy for this is the pandemic.
Okay, the next question, sir, is how do you differentiate this bill from S386? With this bill, is there going to be a fair distribution of visas for various countries?
This bill is unconnected to 386. I mean, 386 is a different matter, and we've been down that road together before. And the concern about the cutting out of some populations, like nurses from the Philippines. And of course, there have been various changes in 386, and the bill is currently stalled because certain agreements that have been made have not gone forward. But what this does is it ends the backlog for doctors, who I'd say are the highest priority people in that regular backlog. And it ends the backlog that's recently been created for nurses. And the visas will be given out without regard to country, but there's no problem of one country dominating because the doctors will all be Indians, except maybe a few Chinese, because they're the people in the backlog, and there are no doctors beside that in the backlog. Half of the nurses will probably be Filipino, because that's the way the numbers work in most years. So about half, and the other half will be from other countries around the world.
Okay, so the next question is from Dan from Southern California. So what about those with no approved petitions? Is it too late to be petitioned?
No, if your petition were approved tomorrow and the bill then passed, you would be eligible. The deadline on approval of a petition is 90 days after the end of the declared emergency. The emergency is in effect right now. The President's declaration of the emergency is in effect. It hasn't been ended. There's no end date has been selected, but at some point, the end date, the President will say, this is the end of the emergency. We don't know when that'll happen, but whenever that happens, there'll be 90 more days after that to have your petition approved. Obviously, getting your petition approved I'm sorry, it's not approval, it's filing. So, I mean, as long as it's filed within that time frame, you're still eligible to get one of the 25,000.
Those are all the questions that we got. It looks like we covered all of them. Bruce, is there anything else you wanted to include before we wrap up?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for your attendance at this event and for your support of PNAA and its work on behalf of nurses in the United States, especially on behalf of the thousands of Filipino nurses who have come here over the years and have been a bulwark of our nursing profession in this country. So thank you for being part of that. It makes a big difference. Your support matters to people in the Congress because you're nurses. You know what it's about. I mean, there's lots of support. The American Hospital Association, CJFNS, these are important organizations that are supporting this bill, but nobody's more important than the people who've lived the experience of being a nurse and who've lived the experience of immigrating as a nurse and knows what the value is and knows, what it takes to get it done. So support really matters. If PNAA decides that they're willing to support this legislation, it will be important to reach out to senators in whatever state you're located, asking your senators to co-sponsor this bill because there's nothing like a voice from home to get people's attention.
Great, thank you, Bruce. We have learned a great deal from you tonight. Now it's my great honor to invite our PNAA President, Madeline Yu, for some parting remarks. Madeline?
Hi. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Thank you, Attorney Mukul Bakshi, for educating us. It's always good to be clarified with whatever bill is before the Senate or before Congress, so the nurses are made aware of the latest moves in immigration and all that. So in the midst of this pandemic, we were wondering exactly what are the countries trying to do? Because we also heard that there might be a stop on immigration by the Philippine president, won't allow the nurses to come out of the Philippines. So this move is being done in the US, but I'm sure the Philippines has its own moves also. But it's always good to hear what's going on around us. So we will disseminate the information that you've given us tonight to the rest of the PNAA members, and we will present it to the executive board, and if we'll try to get a vote for them to support this. So thank you so much again, Mr. Morrison, for always coming to us and being a friend to the PNAA.
Thank you. Thank you for your hospitality.
Yeah. Thank you, Mads. We appreciate you being here. But before I forget, I just want to let you know that Jose Victor Chan Gonzaga, the Consul General of the Embassy of the Philippines, actually is with us in attendance. So thank you, sir, for being here. Last but not the least, on behalf of the Legislative Committee, Bong Dayan, Rowena David, Cam Felizmino, Jeneline Lano, Victoria Pike, Ophelia Solem, Marisa Uzman, Velma Yep, and Vicky Navarro, our advisor. Thank you for all joining us today. And without your continued support, we would never have to put events like this. So again, thank you and good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.